The following is a presentation of Cable 8, Howard Community College.
I'm Dwight Burrell, president of Howard Community College, and this is Howard Perspectives, part of our ongoing effort to emphasize the community in community college. Throughout this series, we'll meet some of the people who are shaping the future of Howard County, and we'll look at the events, issues, and opportunities that will impact our growth, casting a new light, a fresh perspective on Howard County. And now please join me for Howard Perspectives. Good evening and welcome to Howard Perspectives. We're going to discuss Almira Hart Lincoln Phelps this evening, who was the headmistress of the Patapsco Female Institute, which was located in Ellicott City. And we're fortunate to have right here on our own Howard Community College staff the soon-to-be, or maybe by the time this show is aired, it will be, Dr. Helen Mitchell. Who is Associate Dean of Continuing Education here at Howard Community College. Helen has completed her dissertation on the topic of Almira Hart Lincoln Phelps. I could get all those names in. And her role in early education, particularly education of women here in Howard County. Helen has an impressive set of credentials, bachelor's degree in philosophy from Hood College, 2 master's degrees from Loyola, one in reading and one in modern studies. And of course her real claim to fame is being married to Joe Mitchell, who's an outstanding instructor of history at Centennial High School, and they have a son, Jason, who is a sophomore, right, at Harvard University. And they're certainly very proud of him. Helen has lived in Howard County for over 27 years, and it's really good to have you here this evening.
Thanks very much. It's good to be here.
You know, I'm sure that everyone in our audience is eminently familiar with Almira, but just in case there might be 1 or 2 people out there, and certainly I need some education about this, tell us a little bit about who she was, you know, how she got here, what she was doing here, and so on.
Well, she was born in Connecticut to a large family. She was the 17th and last child. 17th. There were 2 mothers. Her mother was the mother of 10, and the previous mother had 7 children. She came from an unusual family for those times. She was born in the 18th century, at the end of the 18th century, shortly after the Revolution. Her father had fought in the Revolution. But the family was politically liberal and religiously somewhat free-thinking. They attended a Congregationalist church, but the father used to have arguments with the minister about points of theology. And
what was his business?
He was a farmer. I suppose a gentleman farmer of sorts, and kind of a New England intellectual, as people were in those days. And the family were also Jeffersonians in the heart of New England federalism, which made them on the minority side on 2 counts. But she grew up in this very organic community in which everyone knew and understood their place and the structure of things and the hierarchies, and also being at the bottom of a family hierarchy, she learned how to get things done within a power structure. And she also learned, I think, the value of a stable society, and all of her life sought to recreate that stable, organic, hierarchical community that had served her so well.
Well, being 17th, she probably had more than 2 mothers. She probably had about 5 or 6.
Absolutely, she did. And interestingly, her next eldest sibling was Emma Willard, her mentor for many years and her lifelong friend as well as sister. And Emma Willard was, of course, the pioneer in women's education, opening the Troy Female Seminary in 1819. She petitioned the New York legislature for a charter and opened her school. And it really was the first one to get a lot of publicity. Not the first one to be opened, but the first one to get a major press.
Was Almira there with her? Did she assist in that?
She did eventually do that. Emma taught her as a youth, and then she attended common and district schools. But then Emma moved to Middlebury, Vermont when she married and opened a school first in her home and then later the Troy Seminary. And in fact, after Almira's first marriage, which lasted about 6 years, and her husband died from a yellow fever epidemic, she was left with 2 children and no source of income, and Emma invited her to come to Troy and work there, and she learned a lot. She learned one of her principal interests, in fact, developed during that time. She worked with Amos Eaton, who was a botanist at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, also in Troy.
So she had a varied academic background.
Yes, she did. And in fact, botany was just becoming a science at that time. And so Eaton had the idea that women were in no more danger of being in the same classroom with men than being in a church with men. So
but
he
that
encouraged.
was not the common belief
Not at all.
time.
Not at all. He was a very unusual man, and she was lucky to hook up with him. So he taught her botany, and then she went back to Troy and put her newfound knowledge to work. And when she discovered that there really wasn't a good textbook, he encouraged her to use her class lectures as a textbook, and she did that, and it was called Lincoln's Botany. That was her first name, Almira Hart Lincoln.
It wouldn't be known that it was written by a woman.
I don't know. Maybe that's possible, yeah. But it was published, it was used virtually all over the United States, translated into foreign languages, and became the botany textbook. So that launched her on a kind of scientific career, which she, I'm sure, wouldn't have planned, and got her in the cutting edge of the new science of botany. Then she took up chemistry, then natural philosophy or physics. She took up geology, but only did an elementary textbook, and then things moved very quickly, and she never revised it.
How did she find people to study with in these various sciences? Did she teach herself, or?
Somewhat she taught herself. She studied with Amos Eaton, both biology and chemistry. He was actually a chemist. Natural philosophy, I believe, she probably was largely self-taught, and there were local societies beginning to be interested in natural philosophy, and so she also had Professor Darlington of maybe Amherst, and she was connected with some of those better-known names, but was largely self-taught, as all of these women were.
So what brought her to Maryland? What made the transition that caused her to decide to come down here?
Well, first I have to take you quickly through her second marriage. After her first widowhood, she went to Troy, and then she was courted by the father of one of the Troy students, who was himself a widower. She married John Phelps, a lawyer from Vermont, and they lived there for a while. And then she received an invitation to be the headmistress of a boarding school for girls in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And she took that in 1838, was there for a year. The school failed largely because of the bank failure of 1837 and the panic. And then she was invited to Rahway, New Jersey, to head the Rahway Female Institute. She
would have been in her late 40s
that's
by
right.
that time.
Not a young woman at all, and yet really at the beginning of a long career, a second career in many ways. So she was in Rahway for 2 years, and then the Patapsco Female Institute, which had begun in 1837, had also fallen on hard times because of the financial situation. The trustees, it was chartered as a secular institute. A local group of prominent citizens had gotten together and chartered it. And it was floundering, not many students, not financially doing very well. And they hooked up with the Episcopal bishop, William Whittingham, who was very interested in education, and they asked him, would he like to make it a kind of diocesan school? They believed that would enhance enrollments, which it did. So
and get them some additional support?
Yes, not financial support.
Oh, really?
No, just, but by bringing students in, of course, that was the major source of income.
And maybe credibility?
And credibility, absolutely. And there was a network, of course, throughout the country, and that helped. So he wrote her on behalf of the trustees and the Episcopal Church, asking her to come and be headmistress in 1841. And she left Rahway, which was a flourishing institution. But her letter, her first letter to Bishop Whittingham, is a remarkable letter for a woman in the 19th century.
And were her letters your major source
Yes.
of information about her? Was there much other written material?
Well, it's interesting. She kept a diary for 75 years
Oh, my goodness.
and burned it, had it burned on her death. So that would have been, of course, my primary piece of data, and I didn't have it.
You've
but
never
the letters,
forgiven her for that.
Never. But the letters were great, and we only have hers because she burned the letters people wrote to her. So we, for the most part, do not have Bishop Whittingham's responses, but we have, and you can piece together. There's one letter that he had copied by a seminarian, and then there are his letters to priests in the diocese, which shed some light. But her first letter back to him is a remarkable piece of power politics, I would have to say. She started out by saying, were I interested in changing my position, I would hasten to accept your offer. But being happily situated, I'm in no great hurry. And then she listed her
Good
points.
bargaining
Yes,
position, right?
absolutely. Here are my unnegotiable, non-negotiable points that must be met before I can even consider your offer. And the most controversial was that she wanted the chaplain to be responsible not only to the bishop, but to the institute and to the people who pay his salary, so that he would not only have to satisfy the needs of the church, but also the needs of the institution. And she was very anxious to safeguard her power to dismiss unruly students, her power to...
She must have had some experiences then at one of these prior institutions with some problems in that area.
I think you're right. She did allude to having had uncomfortable experiences with trustees. I would never relinquish my power again willingly or whatever. And so they haggled back and forth about the chaplain thing. And it was, to Bishop Whittingham, the condition under which he would associate himself formally was that a chaplain be named. And so until they could work this out, he was not willing to become visitor, it was called, and that made the school a kind of diocesan school. Finally, they settled on that, and she did come in October of 1841. The building was unfinished. There was rubble. She told later, she wrote an essay to the girls, the students, and she talked about climbing up from the depot in Ellicott City, up this winding serpentine path, and there was this rubble in her way and brambles. It was very metaphorical, a lot like Bradford's Journal of Plymouth Plantation. And when she got to the top, there were swine rooting at the... It was not an auspicious beginning. And she really wondered whether anybody would come, or as she said to Whittingham, come a second time. Once they'd been, there were no real passable roads, and so...
And yet the school had been in operation for 3 or 4 years?
Yes, that's right. But it had been a much smaller scale operation, a much more local operation. When she came, she brought, I think probably brought with her some students from New Jersey and Pennsylvania, some northern students. But it's interesting that the student body at the beginning was, excluding Maryland students, exactly half and half from slave-holding and free states. And as her tenure continued, became very heavily Southern. So that was one of the interesting things. She was in a state below the Mason-Dixon line, which made her eligible to draw on the Southern clientele.
Did she continue her writing then when she...
She did. In fact, when she married John Phelps, she retired for 7 years into domesticity because he had a number of children and she had several children.
So she had to raise them.
She had to raise them. But she was nothing, of course she was not idle, and one of the things she did was to revise her textbooks. She wrote second editions of Lincoln's Botany and some of the other heavily academic textbooks. And then in response to student requests and parent requests, she wrote simpler versions, botany for beginners, chemistry for beginners, because a lot of this was so new, and she was heavily dependent in botany on the Linnaean system of classification, which is a very good system, but fairly complicated. And so I think she wanted to introduce students who were maybe not equipped to deal with the higher level things. And she also saw the sciences as proof texts for the existence of God.
Oh, really?
Yes, and that
now,
enabled...
that's an interesting connection, because there was really a feeling that the sciences threatened religion. I would assume it was prevailing in that period.
And I think that was one of the ways she was able to justify her own interest and to sort of sell science for girls to parents and whatever, because you're exactly right. She saw the science versus religion debate as a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
And for herself, when she looked at a flower, she saw it as evidence of the handiwork of God, and she believed everyone else would too. And she also believed, interestingly, that in chemistry, humans would never be able to replicate organic compounds, living compounds. She was unaware that a German scientist had already synthesized urea in, I don't know, 1850 or something. And she would continually say that. We're able to do the inorganized, she said, inorganic compounds, but we are prevented because these are the secrets of life and only God controls these. So it was very interesting. She was on a number of issues on the cutting edge, but never saw herself as a rebel, always saw herself as a part of the hierarchy, part of the system, and she was able to convince others that what she was doing was not radical at all.
She was. She didn't get a lot of resistance to teaching science to women?
No, she didn't.
A serious threat.
It should have been, but it wasn't. And I think largely, and I don't know how much of this was conscious and how much just subconscious good sense, but she really, from an observer's point of view later on, crafted it exceedingly smoothly. And because she was able to put everything into an acceptable framework, and the framework was, of course, a woman's sphere is the home, the domestic environment. But
she maintained that.
She maintained that throughout. But the home kept getting bigger, and the sphere included
everything is in the home.
Everything. Well, the school became her family, and she and many others, and including male presidents of colleges, would refer to the students as my family, the teachers, and even the servants. So she continued that family metaphor.
But that was not too uncommon with the extended families of that day. You could have aunts and uncles and distant cousins. So,
exactly. So she just pushed it a little more. And so she was always able to say, I think, to herself as well as to others, I'm certainly not a rebel. Oh, no, I support all of the traditional dictums of religion, of society. And all I'm trying to do is give girls an opportunity to see to their own self-support. She was very concerned about women having to marry for maintenance, you know, make a match just because they couldn't support themselves economically. And so that was how she sold it. But to Southern families, this was really a bit heretical. And I think she was able to succeed because she played so heavily the theme of home and hearth and religion, and it made the rest of it seem more palatable.
So that was a cover for her to move into these areas.
Yes.
There were a lot of reform movements going on at that time. How did she relate to those?
Well, she was opposed to most of the major reform movements that we would think of, both abolitionism and women's suffrage.
Is that right?
She was opposed to them, and I really at first found this perplexing because she was quite radical. But both of those challenged existing hierarchies. She believed, along with her second husband, that slavery, whatever its moral character, was guaranteed by the Constitution and therefore legal. And she sometimes would say not prohibited in either the Old or New Testament. So she found it to have a quasi-sanction. And I think she favored a hierarchical society where everyone knew their place. Of course, she was in the favored class, the favored race, the favored whatever.
Right.
But she found it very threatening to talk about challenging those hierarchies. And so she condoned slavery. I wouldn't say supported it, but she made it clear that she was not going to challenge, she was not going to preach abolitionist rhetoric, and she couldn't have.
How did she rationalize the constitutional basis? Where did she look to build that? Do you know?
Her husband built the case, and she really pretty much echoed. Well, I think because when the Constitution was drafted, slaves were, you know, the 3/5 compromise. They were 3/5 a person, but it sort of gave legal sanction indirectly to the whole.
Because it wasn't addressed.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that was probably it. And then women's suffrage was even more threatening because it challenged the hierarchy of the family, and it said that a woman should have a vote apart from her husband, which implied a dichotomy, and she couldn't support that.
Which would mean that the family unit might not necessarily be one solid structure.
And of course, she had so many connections that she was able to get whatever she wanted. She was wealthy. She earned a lot of money from her textbooks and from her school. Yes. And that's also kind of unusual and became threatening to many people. But she didn't need the vote. And she was unable to see that other people who didn't have her advantages might need it because they had no legal redress for things and no other power.
It was not particularly common for a woman to have wealth of her own right.
No.
A woman might have wealth because her husband had died and she had inherited it, but to earn it herself was not common, was it?
Not common, and again, I think that should have been more threatening. In fact, it was threatening in the end to the chaplains, who saw her as not only their sort of institutional superior, but she was obviously more wealthy than they were, and that put them in a two-down position, and they found that very threatening.
So did she have a lot of problems with the chaplains? Was there tension as they came through the institution?
With some of them, yes, and with others, no. And in fact, earlier on, not so much of a problem, but indeed, I believe that one of the chaplains was responsible for her losing the connection with the Episcopal diocese because of this jealousy over the money. And in fact, he wrote to the bishop and said he had scruples about whether he, as an ordained minister, ought to be serving a cause that worked to the financial betterment, not of the kingdom of God, but of Almira, Hart, Lincoln, Phelps.
Was she benefiting financially from the institution?
Apparently she was. She had the sort of lease that forced her to make improvements in the buildings and pay all the expenses, but apparently allowed her to keep the profits. And so she was able to parlay it into quite a successful operation. When she came, the school had had, I think, 6 or 8, maybe 15 students the previous year, and she built it up to 140.
Oh, really?
So they were boarding students, all of them, and they paid quite high rates for the time.
So there was considerable cash changing hands, whether
whether
she kept it or whether she didn't.
That's right. Her daughter later said that she'd made $200,000 over her lifetime, and that was an enormous sum of money by the 1860s or 70s.
Well, what did she contribute to the institution in her tenure? How long did she serve?
1841 to 56, 15 years. And really the golden age of the Patapsco Institute. It had an earlier beginning, as we've discussed, and it was forced to stop during the Civil War. It reopened in 1864 or 5 and limped along for another, really 25 years till 1891, but it never regained its prestige and
did
power.
She have 100+ students during most of that 15-year period?
Yes. She built up pretty rapidly into the 90s, and then I think it peaked at 141, but yes, sustained high enrollments.
So she must have done a heck of a marketing job.
You bet.
Along the way. Was that her major contribution, marketing the institution?
Well, that was certainly a contribution because the school couldn't survive without students, and that was clearly the bottom line. But no, I would say that she, among others, pioneered a serious academic education for young women as opposed to the finishing school type of education that had been the norm, a little French, a little harpsichord, a little painting, you know, the kind of the finer drawing room.
She was teaching the sciences.
Absolutely. Because of her interest in the sciences, and that was probably a contribution that she made overall because at Troy she introduced the sciences and that was the pioneering institution. Heavily natural sciences oriented, mathematics, Latin, occasionally a little Greek, literature, history, quite a standard liberal arts kind of curriculum, which was really not being done. Boys, of course, were getting heavy Latin, heavy Greek, and they were being prepared for the ministry, government service, or the military. It was clear that girls were not on that track, but they were getting more like the ancient Greek, a little of everything for the kind of classical, well-rounded education.
Was she teaching the sciences herself, or was she able to find people to come in and teach them?
She taught, originally taught herself, and then I think she did hire people. There was an enormous network that developed almost immediately at Troy. Students would learn the academic subjects, and then they would be sent out kind of fanned out through the country and primarily through the South. And then they stayed in touch, and there was a kind of teachers association, the Willard Association for the Improvement of Teachers. Emma and Almira both lent students money to complete their education on the premise that they would pay it back.
Teach for them.
Kind of a guaranteed student loan. Or, you know, they'd pay the money back after they got jobs.
Yeah.
And so there was that kind of informal empowerment and academic preparation that went on, and then students, once they had learned, were able to go out and even set up their own schools, but at least be teachers.
Well, I would assume over time she'd be able to draw on some of her own students to come back and teach.
Yes, indeed she did.
But early on, she probably had to do it herself.
She did, and then she had John's children. A couple of John's daughters went into teaching, John Phelps, and even her own daughters, two of her own daughters.
Now, did she hire them to teach there then?
Them.
So it was kind of a family operation.
Yes. And when John died, he died in 1849. I should have said that he was the business manager of the Institute, and in fact had served in that capacity at her two previous institutions. But she was always the major breadwinner, which was also kind of an unusual situation. Right. He was in his 60s, though. He was a good deal older than she, and he had sort of retired from the law. But when he died in 1849, her daughter Jane, her eldest daughter Jane, took over the role of bookkeeper and sort of vice principal or something of the academic structure of the institution. And then Jane was killed in a railroad accident in 1855. And that was the sort of the nominal cause for her leaving. She had, I think, grown weary with the struggle, and the chaplains had been causing her some problems, wore her down, right. And although she was still doing well and still attracting students, she really began to wear out. And so the death of Jane was the straw that broke the camel's back, and she began then to negotiate her departure. But she'd lost the connection with the Episcopal Church in 1852.
How did that happen?
That was the chaplain who wrote the bishop and stirred up his misgivings.
And that was enough to cut it off?
Yes. And that really crushed Almira. She never got over that. She felt, interestingly, that she herself had a calling from God in the strictly ministerial or priestly sense of the word. She felt she had a vocation. She used to write to Whittingham and say that she felt that he was the instrument in her call. And so for her, having his connection legitimized the whole operation, and it was almost like God's approval.
Right.
So when she lost that, she lost some of her self-justification, and I suppose in her eyes some of her societal justification.
Did that hurt the student enrollment?
It didn't seem to, but for her something really critical had been lost, and so she wasn't, her enthusiasm and her kind of confidence were eroded. Made it more difficult.
What happened to her then after she left in 1856?
Well, she moved to Baltimore and bought a house in the Mount Vernon area on Utah Place, which was the fashionable heart of Baltimore City. And because she had this independent wealth, she opened a kind of salon where she entertained, her son Charles became a congressman, so she'd entertain Congress, she'd entertain high-ranking Episcopal Church people, and she had little musical evenings. And Almira had the good fortune to be born, lived another 28 years in this third incarnation. So she lived to her 91st birthday, died on her birthday, July 15th, and in the Morning Mail came an article that she had written, a genealogical article on the Hart and Hooker families, who were her Puritan ancestors. So up until her very last year, she was still writing.
Incredible.
Yep.
Very, very interesting individual in Howard County's history. Helen, thank you very much for sharing this with us, and we're going to do another show on the Patapsco Female Institute, so we'll find more about that school when we discuss that. Thank you for being with me this evening.
My pleasure.
And thank all of you for joining us on Howard Perspectives. Have a good evening.
The following is a presentation of Cable 8, Howard Community College.
I'm Dwight Burrell, president of Howard Community College, and this is Howard Perspectives, part of our ongoing effort to emphasize the community in community college. Throughout this series, we'll meet some of the people who are shaping the future of Howard County, and we'll look at the events, issues, and opportunities that will impact our growth, casting a new light, a fresh perspective on Howard County. And now please join me for Howard Perspectives. Good evening and welcome to Howard Perspectives. Our topic this evening is the Patapsco Female Institute, a local noted historical site here in Howard County. And we're fortunate to have Dr. Helen Mitchell, who's the Associate Dean of Continuing Education here at Howard Community College, to speak with us on the topic. Helen did her dissertation on Almira, I got to look this up, Almira, Hart, Phelps, who was a prominent head mistress at the Institute, and we want to talk a little bit about Almira at the beginning, but we will focus on the Patapsco Institute and its role in the educational history of Howard County and Maryland. Helen's credentials are impressive. She has a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Hood College, 2 master's degrees, one in reading and another in modern studies, both from Loyola College. She has worked here at Howard Community College since 1974, is that right?
Right.
And been in charge of continuing education since 1979. She's married to Joe Mitchell, who's an instructor in history at Centennial High School, and they have a son, Jason, who's now a sophomore at Harvard University. So they're both very proud of Jason. Helen, tell me a little bit about Almira, because she really is sort of the spark plug of the Patapsco Institute, although it existed before and after. But who is she and how did she get here?
Well, she absolutely was the spark plug and is responsible for the tremendous growth that the Institute experienced during her tenure. It really grew from a somewhat lackluster institution to a flourishing, very prominent one throughout the United States. Almira had the good fortune to be born the baby sister of Emma Willard, who was probably the best-known pioneer of education for women. Almira was the 17th and last child in a large New England family.
Very large.
Very large. And that might have been a handicap in other families, because the money for education would have been depleted. But in this family, the older siblings, the brothers in particular, really saw to it that the younger children, Emma and Almira, were both educated. And the family also, for their day, were well educated and made it a point to read to the children around the fireside at night from the Roman classics and from the English classics, and to encourage free thinking. And the dissenters in the community often came to the Hart home. And
Parents were not educators, though.
No, they weren't. The father was a farmer, and then the mother was a housewife. But both of them, for their day, had a better education than most people. And
obviously had a passion for learning and reading.
Indeed.
That was passed on.
Indeed, a passion for learning. And for the power of ideas to change things. The father had fought in the Revolution, so they were intimately associated with that struggle. And then they were also related to the prominent New England families, the Hookers and the Harts. And so they were tied ideologically as well as through family lineage to the founding religious and civic principles that had made America a republic. And they felt very keenly this identification.
But not necessarily They didn't necessarily espouse the prominent thinking of the time, though.
No, they were quite rebellious in some interesting ways. The family was nominally Congregationalists, but Captain Hart, Almira's father, would argue with the minister about the Sunday sermon. And
that was not a real popular thing to do in those days.
Not real popular, no. And Almira remembers the minister coming to the house before breakfast one morning. You can imagine how strongly he felt. And the two of them having a shouting match. But they always worked it out. And apparently this sort of layperson's theology was not all that uncommon among the farmers of Connecticut. And her mother was, of course, a quieter person. She taught all of the domestic virtues, but the family were also politically very liberal. They were Jeffersonian Republicans in the heart of New England federalism, and they had relatives who were high Federalists. In fact, Almira lived with some of these relatives during the War of 1812, and she was on the unpopular side, and had an opportunity to give her first toast as a young woman and said, "Success to the arms of our country," which raised a gasp among her high Federalist relatives. So she really had an unusual childhood, which gave her, I think, the justification for pursuing ideas, which was not an automatic given for a woman in the 19th century. And a sense...
And the autonomy,
yes,
independence to go ahead and pursue her own ideas and not be subordinated to...
Correct. And that's a gift I think a father can give a daughter, especially then, but even so today. It legitimized her independent thinking. And of course, at times she, I'm sure, went against her parents' ideas, but they did encourage her to be her own person.
So where did she get her academic background, academic training, formal academic training?
She was a student at the district schools and the common schools in the area, and then she had a cousin, Nancy Hinsdale, and she attended Nancy's school for a while. She also was the pupil, as well as the younger sister, of Emma, who was 6 years older. And then when Emma married Dr. Willard and moved to Middlebury, Vermont, Almira came and studied in a semi-formal way with the Willards. Emma was at the time teaching herself many subjects, and with the Willards lived Dr. Willard's nephew, John, who was a student at Middlebury College, and two other students who were boarders. And so Almira had a chance informally to match her wits against theirs and to study some of the same subjects they were studying.
So she was steeped in an academic environment for a number of years, as well as getting formal training.
Absolutely.
Well, let's jump for a moment to the Patapsco Female Institute. How did it get started? We'll connect this up later and get Almira back.
I trust you. A group of prominent citizens, lawyers and judges and businessmen, as was very, very typical, decided that their town needed to have an academy or a seminary. This one was called an institute, but they were all pretty much interchangeable. And in the South, many of them called themselves colleges, but they were all pretty much serious secondary schools. So in 1834, they got together at the Patapsco Hotel in Ellicott's Mills, which was the name of the town.
Now, would the Ellicott brothers have been a part of that group, or was this...
No, this was after the Ellicott brothers, but they had donated the land on which Patapsco was built, so it was their legacy in a very real sense. And they applied for a charter through the state legislature, which was granted in 1837, and it was chartered as a seminary, which was a secular institute for higher learning for young women. And then they hired as the first headmaster an Episcopal priest, Reverend Ting. And he was there for a year and did not make a go of it. He had the bad fortune of starting a school in the same year that the banks failed, and there was a large financial panic in 1837. Would have been the
equivalent of starting a school in 1932, I suppose.
Absolutely right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
A lot of uncertainty, and the fees were quite high, and for families to commit that kind of money, often this was precluded by what was happening throughout the larger economic picture.
And I suppose also committing that kind of money to an unknown entity would have been even riskier.
Indeed, no reputation. So he lasted a year, and then they gave the school to Miss Mary Norris, who was an English woman, and she built it up a little more and had a little better success and hired some assistant teachers.
Now this would have been 1836, 1837 in that range?
He had it, I think, 1837 to 38, and then she had it from 1838 to 41.
Okay.
But Mary Norris then indicated that she was willing to give it up, and the school, I I believe, sat empty for a couple of months. The trustees of the school then began to examine the future of their institute and to try to ensure its success. And they decided that they would incorporate the Episcopal bishop into their plans, believing correctly, it turns out, that his prestige and his connections throughout the country would lend credibility and also get them students, Episcopal students, whose
Although there
families
was no
would send them.
direct cash support from the Episcopal Church.
No cash support, but it did become a diocesan school, which meant that every year at the convention the bishop would say, and I'd like to report on the glowing state of affairs at our local diocesan institute for girls.
So
and
a little publicity here.
Yes, and he said he was willing to be a traveling agent for the school, and indeed wrote voluminous correspondence and visited. The entire state of Maryland was the diocese, so it made that whole state very, very much connected.
Were the students primarily from Maryland at that point?
At the beginning they were. The majority of the students were from Maryland, and maybe half again as many from outside of Maryland. Most of them from the north at the beginning when Almira came in 1841. She, I think, may have brought some with her. There may have been some students who were her pupils from previous schools which she had been the headmistress of.
Did the trustees then seek to get rid of Almira's predecessor, or
she had already indicated
on her own volition had decided to leave?
Yes.
So how did they find Almira?
The connection was really Bishop Whittingham, the Episcopal bishop. He had corresponded with Emma Willard, her sister. Years ago, they recommended teachers back and forth. Many people involved in education did that. And Bishop Whittingham had been a priest in New York and was highly concerned with the educational issues of the day. So the trustees empowered Bishop Whittingham to select a person who he believed would be qualified to head their prestigious institution, and he chose Almira.
So Emma recommended Almira then, you think?
I don't think in that direct a way, but I think her earlier connection probably led him to think of that family.
Well, Almira was known at that point for her textbooks.
Yes.
So she wasn't unknown in her own right.
No, she was quite well known, you're right, as the author of botany textbooks, chemistry, natural physics or philosophy, and even geology.
Would she have been seen as something of a catch for the institution?
I think so. I think they really, when they learned that the bishop had secured her services, were very effusive in their praise and believed it would bring honor upon the town as well as be an entree for students.
Your source of information was primarily letters that Almira had written. Were there other documents that you had access to?
Yes, the catalogs and annual reports of the school exist here and there. Not a complete set for 15 years, but at least 10 or 11.
Rosters of students?
Rosters of students and the conditions of acceptance, the curriculum, the academic as well as the non-academic curriculum, and that's something we might want to talk about, and also the informal sort of rules that the girls were expected to live by, and a little bit of Almira's educational philosophy. So they were very helpful.
Those things exist?
Yes, they do.
Well, let's talk about the curriculum for a moment.
Okay.
You say academic and non-academic curriculum. What does that mean?
Well, the academic curriculum, of course, was the standard subjects that you might expect to find, although they were quite a bit more rigorous academically than in many finishing schools that
more
were the
rigorous
norm.
after Almira got there.
Yes, she brought I believe it had pretensions from the beginning, but she really brought a very systematic and progressive curriculum which lasted over 3 years, and the students were expected to have certain skills upon arriving and to be a certain age, 12, or 13. And then it was a structured sequence beginning with a little reading, writing, arithmetic, spelling, perhaps a little handwriting, and then going up through a heavy emphasis on the natural sciences, mathematics.
Which was Almira's contribution.
Her contribution, right.
Now, the girls who had come there at 12 or 13 would not have had any formal education before they got there, would they? Or
maybe a home tutor, since many of them were Southern girls. As the years went on, they might have had a home tutor.
But there wouldn't have been anything like a grade school as we know today, where they would have gone and had any formal training.
Probably not, although that's somewhat unclear. And there may have been some. The girls in Maryland and in the North may have had a common school to go to earlier than the girls in the South, because it was so rural and so spread out. There were some cooperative ventures. Several families would get together and hire a tutor who would tutor all of the girls in a surrounding area, and some of that happened.
So they would, on the academic side, then they'd have the sciences, reading, writing, math. What were the non-academic subjects?
The non-academic subjects, interestingly, were domestic science, which of course was the art of running a home effectively. And I think to some degree this was necessary because if parents were going to send their daughters off, they didn't want them to be ruined for the future, and they would be expected to run a home.
And they were still going to come back at 15 or 16 and be prepared to get married.
Correct.
I mean, that was...
that would be the assumption. That would be the normal track. So domestic science, and then of course moral education. Religious training, although even though it was connected with the Episcopal Church, the students were free to exercise their own private religious practices. But there were heavy emphases on moral reasoning.
What would moral education be?
I gather it was they distinguish between mental philosophy, which I take to be metaphysics maybe, and moral philosophy, which was probably ethics, sort of general principles of right and wrong. And I'm sure they were heavily Protestant, religiously based, but not exclusively.
Were there textbooks on?
Yes, there were textbooks
that outlined the things that one should do and shouldn't do. And
yes, and how one ought to arrive at what the moral thing to do was. I think they probably read Aristotle and some of the ancients, and then kind of worked their way up to the present. And then the interesting third aspect of what I call the non-academic curriculum was physical culture. They were all answering the unspoken or sometimes spoken charge that academics would ruin a girl's health.
Oh, really?
And there were doctors who said that a young woman, first of all, probably didn't have the mental capacity for rigorous academic education, but if she did, it would perhaps make her sterile, take all the blood from her reproductive organs. And
certainly sounds like a risky proposition.
Very risky. And so they were concerned to answer that charge and to say that, no, we will make sure our girls take walks in the open air and do calisthenics and preserve their health. And that was very much worked into the schedule on a regular basis.
And then there would have been the cultural things, music, art, I assume, of some sort or another that would make them cultured ladies.
Exactly. Those were kind of
were those on the academic side?
They were offered, but not part of the curriculum. So that it was there as an option, and I would imagine many of the girls did choose it. But it was not. It was distinguished from math and science and English and philosophy and those other.
Well, under Almira, the school became really quite prestigious throughout the country. And what was where did the girls come from?
Well, that's very interesting. When Almira first came in 1841, if you exclude the Maryland students, there was an even distribution between slaveholding and free states, a balance between North and South,
when she arrived. And how many girls would have been there in that?
Oh, maybe in the 20s or 30s, okay. And then as the 1840s moved along, the balance began to shift in favor of the South, so that by the early 1850s, excluding the Maryland students, 90% from the South and 10% from the North.
How do you account for that shift?
I think as the sectional tensions increased and as it was clear that there were rumblings that might lead to division in the country, for many Southern planter families who were primarily the audience, a school in the North was just out of the question. And prior to this time, families had sent their daughters above the Mason-Dixon line. They were no longer willing to do this.
But that would mess up their thinking if they got up there with the Yankees, right?
You bet. They might be polluted by... And, of course, a lot of Yankees condemned the Southern way of life, which was near and dear to the hearts of Southerners. So there was that to consider. And then also Almira cultivated that Southern audience by making clear that she saw constitutional justification for slavery, whatever its moral character. And she also was not going to interfere with a way of life that, although it might not be her choice, she clearly saw as established.
That's a long way for a girl to come from Florida or Georgia or Arkansas to Maryland. Ellicott City, Maryland, to go to school in those days that was a long trip.
A major trip, and they really spent holidays and everything at the school.
How would they find out about it, and why would they see it as being that significant?
Well, I think one of the reasons was that through her New England roots, both Emma and Almira were connected with Sarah Josepha Hale, who was the editor of Godey's Ladies' Book, which was the most popular magazine for women and had a circulation of 150,000 at its high point.
Heavily through the South or all over the country?
All over the country. And so I think especially in the rural South where you didn't see anybody on a regular basis.
That was your source of information.
That was your source. And she had an editor's table, she called it, in which she promoted various causes. And one of them, near and dear to her heart, was education. And she, like Emma and Almira, had become an adult convert to the Episcopal Church. So they all had that in common in the fact that it was an Episcopal school, was also attractive, and she would promote it as a prominent school in the South.
And were there not a lot of other options for...
There were other options, but I think, as you pointed out earlier, Almira's personal reputation because of her science books made her a very famous person. In the 19th century, her name was used frequently without any explanatory appositive, you know, just Almira Hart Lincoln Phelps,
really?
And everyone was presumed to know.
Immediately?
Yes.
Huh.
And of course, a century later, hardly anyone knows who she is. But she was very, very well known. Her botany textbook was called Lincoln's Botany. That was her first marriage. And it was a household word. Every school probably had a copy in America. Homes many times had them.
So if you were reading your ladies book and you saw the Patapsco Female Institute written up there in this prestigious magazine, it would be something that would be a good marketing technique.
Absolutely. She was very, I think, conscious of those kinds of things, used her network of connections in all of the modern terms that we think of today. She was very entrepreneurial and saw that she needed to get students, and it was a boarding institution exclusively. They did not have day scholars. The only exception to that, as a part of their charter, the state supplied $800 a year to each county, and it was intended primarily for colleges, but where a college did not exist, a secondary school was eligible, and Patapsco got the $800.
Oh, is that right?
It was part of Anne Arundel County in those days.
Right.
And in exchange for that, they had to educate 8 scholars free. And so I think those girls may have been residents of Ellicott's Mills. But apart from that, everybody was a boarding student, which meant they paid several $100s a year. And
Which
if
was
you were,
big bucks in those
big
times.
bucks. And if you were able to attract large numbers of students, and she went up to 141 was her high enrollment, that was a significant amount of money.
That's an incredible size
Yes.
change in a fairly short period of time.
Yes.
What was a typical day like for a girl in that school?
Well, they got up very early. The servant's bell would ring at 4 o'clock.
4 o'clock?
4 o'clock, and some of the very gung-ho students would get up then, but they were at least required to get up by 6 and to make up their rooms, to make up the beds and a little sweeping and dusting. Almira felt very strongly about this. I think from her New England roots, you know, the frugal New England housekeeper was the esteemed image. And she felt that these pampered Southern girls had to have a little dose of this for their character. And the girls took turns on a weekly basis of being in charge of the room. There were 2 to 4 girls in what she called college-style living. She, in fact, had insisted that the building be converted. When it was originally built, there was a large dormitory-style ward arrangement where there were just a lot of beds. And she, at her own expense, enclosed this large space into small apartments. Because
so they had their own little room for 3 or 4...
kind of a suite, more or less, like our children are experiencing. But she insisted that they have charge of this housekeeping detail, and they were evaluated on this. And she had a system which she borrowed from Emma, from her sister Emma at the Troy Seminary, called a monitorial system, in which you got fault marks and credit marks. And the ways to get credit marks were by faithful fulfillment of your duty. So if you did a good job as the room superintendent, you could get a credit mark. But if you violated any of the rules or didn't do a good job, you got a fault mark.
A demerit, as it were.
Demerit, as it were, and those were, of course, reported to the parents. But one of the girls who wrote home to her family, and we have a letter, oh no, I'm sorry, this is a diary, a student diary from a student in South Carolina, said she'd rather take a good switching than be room monitor. She hated it. The responsibility was odious, and the monitors went around and made sure people were not reading during study hours, and it was all a bit like the service academies. This, everybody was your
tight discipline,
your monitor. Yes.
So they got up at 6 o'clock, got the room cleaned up, and then what happened?
Then they had breakfast, and then they had prayers in the chapel. Then they had 3 hours of academics. Then around 12:30 they had lunch. Then they had a little break, and then they had another 3 hours of classroom work. And then they had tea, and then they had study hours, and it was all a very highly structured day until around 9 o'clock when they had evening prayers, at which the fault marks for the day would be read.
Oh, I see.
And the students called to account and explain, if they could, any circumstances for these fault marks. And then, of course, lights out pretty early, since they had to get up pretty early.
Well, also, without electricity, it was probably more tuned to sunrise and sunset.
Yes, you're probably right about that.
Than we would think of today, I would assume.
But she didn't want to leave any unstructured time. It was the sort of New England, the idle brain is the devil's playground. And
now, 6 days a week?
Saturday was not a class day, but it's interesting. She had another little invention. She had sections of about 6 to 8 girls under the direction of a teacher. And the teachers were only a few years older than the girls, many of them probably graduates of the school. She called them curatresses, and they were to be models of deportment, and also, I assume, models of what a young teacher should be like, because Almira was hoping to create teachers among all of the students. And so the curatresses would have the girls into their own rooms on a Saturday morning. Each girl would bring her sewing, and they would have a little uplifting reading. I imagine the girls were thrilled with this. And the curatresses had to give up their Saturday mornings. But this was all part of the indoctrination, that Almira was very concerned to structure the time, the space, the environment in every way. It was a lot like the asylum mentality. Control every aspect of the prisoner's life, and you can affect an inner transformation.
Well, Almira was the head of the Institute, and it was very successful till the middle 1850s.
Yes.
Then she left, and what happened to the Institute then after she left?
She put it into the hands of Dr. and Mrs. Archer, who had run a school in Baltimore. They came out to Ellicott's Mills and brought their students with them. But it was nearing, she left in 1856, and it was nearing the Civil War, and as things got worse and worse, students
90%
stayed
were
at
coming
home.
from the South. That would,
yes. And then when the Civil War actually broke out, the school closed. It did reopen in 1864 or 5, but never was able to recapture its former splendor. It was headed for a while by Sarah Nicholas Randolph, the granddaughter of Thomas Jefferson. And she tried to restore it, but it was just, the country, of course, was never the same. The South was in ruins economically, politically, and things were never able to get back on the same footing. And so the school technically stayed in operation until the 1891.
Oh, really?
But really, it was dribbling away and losing things on a fairly rapid basis, and so.
You can still find the ruins up on the hill in Ellicott City today, so part of it is still there.
It's unfortunate that it deteriorated recently so rapidly.
Is that right? Yeah. Well, thank you very much. This has been a very interesting revelation about a part of Howard County's history that a lot of us are not familiar with. So thank you very much, Helen, for joining me this evening.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank all of you for joining us on Howard Perspectives. Have a good evening.
This has been a presentation of Cable 8, Howard Community College. Cable 8 would like to hear from you. Send your comments to Cable 8, Howard Community College, Columbia, Maryland 21044. That's Cable 8, Howard Community College, Columbia, Maryland 21044. Let's hear from you.